Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Tiffany Chow and I am a member of World Denver's Young Professional Board. And it's a true pleasure to be here with you all and to kick off this panel event, Forging New Paths in National Security, hosted by World Denver. This panel is actually a follow-on to the very successful International Women's Day event that World Denver hosted earlier this month. If you missed that live, don't worry, you can check out the recording on World Denver's website. But we're really excited that with today's panel, we can continue to spotlight and celebrate the stories of women in national security all month long and beyond the month. So thank you for joining us in that. Before I hand things over to our fantastic moderator, Jamie Landers, I have just a few housekeeping items to run through. First, we recommend that everyone select speaker view for the duration of the program. We think it'll help give you the best viewing experience possible. Please also keep yourselves muted. This will help reduce any background noise or potential echo so that we can hear our panelists clearly. And feel free to turn off or keep on your camera, whatever you're most comfortable with. Also, we will have Q&A from the audience at the end of the panel. So please submit any questions that you have for the panelists throughout the program into the chat, and we will be sure to address those later. And finally, if you enjoy today's panel event and want to connect again soon with other globally minded young professionals, mark your calendars for March 30th at 4:30 p.m. for a Global Young Leaders in Dialogue virtual networking event co-hosted by World Denver and its partners. So now on to the main event. It is truly a great honor to introduce our moderator, Jamie Landers, who is not only a good friend, but someone I admire so much professionally and personally. A bit about Jamie first. She's currently the Director of Advanced Programs at Lockheed Martin Space, where her entrepreneurial spirit and innovative mindset drive rapid technology development for strategic partners across the commercial, civil, and military space sectors, which is pretty impressive in itself. But did you know that Jamie also recently claimed the title of champion on the cooking channel's Sugar Showdown? Pretty sweet, if you ask me. And that pun was definitely intended. So now over to you, Jamie.
Well, thank you so much, Tiffany. It is a pleasure to be here with everybody, our panelists and our audience. We are so excited to have you here today and have this discussion about women in national security. Everyone here today on our panel has taken different paths in their national security careers, and I'm so excited that they're going to share some of their best practices with us, their lessons learned, as well as talk a little bit about their role in national security and how they support some of the initiatives that they work on. So I'm not going to do it justice. I'm going to actually let them introduce themselves. I'm really honored again to be here with everyone. And I'm going to start off with Jaysha Ray. She is the Associate Administrator for International Affairs for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. So Jaysha, could you introduce yourself for us today?
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. And it's really a pleasure to be here. So I'll just briefly describe my career path and highlight a few takeaways that may be useful for all of you in your careers. So I started off as a Presidential Management Fellow, which is a 2-year fellowship to recruit and retain career civil servants. And you have a home agency, but the cool thing about that fellowship is you get to do rotations across the government. And so my home agency was the State Department, and I was hired there to work on sanctions. But I have to admit, it's an issue area that I wasn't super passionate about. But my tip there is sometimes you just got to get your foot in the door. And everything changed in 2007 when China shot down one of its own satellites, creating thousands of pieces of space debris that will be orbiting in space for decades to come. And I was quickly transferred to the Space Office to help out with the diplomatic response. And from that point forward, I decided to dedicate my fellowship towards space. And so I did a rotation in the Space Office in the Pentagon, and then I went over to the National Reconnaissance Office. And that's part of the intelligence community, and they operate our spy satellites. And while I was working there in 2008, we learned that there was a satellite falling to Earth with 1,000 pounds of frozen hydrazine. And I got to participate as the State Department liaison officer on the operation to shoot it down, or what we termed engage the satellite. And I'll just note that this was very exciting, but also very different from the way China shot down its satellite. We did it very transparently, and it had a lower altitude, so much less debris. But then I realized that I had a training requirement to meet in my fellowship. And I discovered something called International Space University, which I know might sound made up, but it's real. And I was nervous about approaching my bosses about it, but I got up the courage and was able to successfully advocate for the government to send me on official training to Space University in Barcelona, Spain for a summer. And so my advice there is it never hurts to ask. Even if you think there's no hope, you might as well ask, within reason, of course. And then after returning to Washington in 2009, there was the first ever collision of an active satellite. And so that was a communication satellite that collided with a dead Russian satellite. And so 3 years, 3 crazy, fascinating space events, and I was hooked. And I said to myself, space is my thing, and that's where I'm going to dedicate my career. And after spending 5 years working on space issues, space diplomacy at the State Department, I saw there was a cyber job announced at our embassy in London. And I spent days studying the linkages between space and cyber, and I went back and forth, should I even apply? But I was able to convince my interviewers that I was qualified for this job based on my space experience, which means I could quickly learn the cyber pieces. And I spent 2 years at our embassy in London working on cyber policy and, of course, also space policy and nuclear policy. And the tip here is don't be afraid to apply for jobs, even though you feel you might not be qualified for them, but just make sure to do your research in advance and be ready to convince your interviewers. So I learned cyber policy while in London and came back to Washington and was asked to go over to the National Security Council as the Director for International Cyber Policy, where I thought I would be working on interagency, bilateral, multilateral engagement on cybersecurity and with our international partners. But one day I was asked to start covering 5G, and this was a new issue for me. And so I had to quickly get up to speed, working closely with departments and agencies in the private sector, and later became the primary drafter of the National Strategy to Secure 5G, which was signed by the president. So I leveraged this experience working on 5G to apply for my current position at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, part of the Department of Commerce, a job that I would have never guessed that I would find myself in earlier in my career. And so in summary, my career path has led me from sanctions to space to cyber to now 5G. And who knows what opportunity might be next. So my key advice to all of you is be open to these new opportunities, but don't try to plan too much because who knows what might come your way. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jaysha. What an exciting ride that you certainly went on. Thank you for sharing your experience and some of those great tips with us. We'll move on to introduce our next panelist, Sahana Dama Puri. She is the director of Our Secure Future. So Sahana, will you please introduce yourself to everyone?
Thanks so much, Jamie. And thanks to World Denver for hosting this panel. It's really a pleasure to be with such standout women. So kind of similar to Jaysha, although I work in a totally different field. I work in women, peace, and security. And I would describe myself as a feminist, a peacenik, and definitely a daydreamer. So how did I get into foreign policy? I think what Jaysha said is really true, that there really isn't a straight career path, and I certainly didn't have one. The field of women, peace, and security is new, and it's been developing over the last 20 years, and I have just been lucky to sort of have a front row seat because my career has been developing over the last 20 years and I was able to, kind of follow it. But I'll tell you this one story about sort of getting started. I always knew in college that I was very much an idealist. I was interested in world peace. I wanted to work on human rights. But coming from a family of immigrants and my parents are both doctors, they were like, how are you going to get paid to work on peace? Like that, how will that ever happen? You need to go to medical school, you need to go to law school. But I was really determined to figure this out. So I did go to graduate school and I studied public policy and Middle East studies. But back then, this was before September 11th, nobody really understood why I was studying Middle East studies and public policy. Those two things, just area specialties and public policy, didn't really go together. But during that time, I did think, oh, I should sit in on a political science class. I'll take an IR class. I'm at University of Chicago. Why not? And I was the only woman out of 8 students, and the professor was also a man. And every morning before I would go to class, I would read the paper, the actual paper back then. And the headlines were about the genocide in Rwanda, they were about Bosnia, the ethnic cleansing. And then I fully expected to go to class and have discussions about people's lives and what was happening. Why was the international community not acting to protect civilians? What was happening to those people, those families, the women, the children, the husbands, brothers, etc. But that's not what happened. I would basically see the news, see what was happening in the world, and go to the IR class. And we really spent time talking about how many missiles Russia had, or Soviet Union had, and how many missiles US had. And I really thought, gosh, I must not really understand this subject at all, because I don't understand how human rights fits in with this. Maybe it's not a security issue. And because of that experience, I thought, okay, well, I'm just gonna find whatever I can that talks about peace. And when I graduate, and I was lucky because after graduate school, I came to Washington, DC, and I got a job at the Center for Middle East Peace. And that was during the Clinton administration. So there was a lot of hope then, and people were working on the Middle East peace process. And we started to support it from an NGO perspective, not a government perspective. And so I would say perhaps my experience might be a bit different than other people on the panel. And then I come from very much a nonprofit, civil society background. But during the course of my career, I was able to get a fellowship at USAID, which is it's similar to the PMF, but also different. And I would say that is a really good tip, is to look for fellowships in your mid-career. There are so many, and they're so varied, but they're really excellent for women to advance your career and get into, and as Jaysha said, open the doors to places that you may not be able to get into. So that put me squarely in the Office of Women in Development at USAID. And there I was trained to be a gender advisor. And they asked me, what's the portfolio you want? And I said, oh, I want to work on peace, women and peace. And they said, we don't have any portfolio like that, but we do work on conflict. So what you need to do is you need to go around to the different bureaus and find people who work on women's stuff, that women's stuff, and find out what kind of programs they're doing. And actually that turned out to be one of the best opportunities I had. I was forced to go and be really entrepreneurial within this large agency and meet my counterparts in so many different offices. And I really learned about the entire agency and what they were doing, whether it was in humanitarian relief or it was democracy and governance, etc. So I'll just say, so after that, I did leave my position at USAID and I started consulting, and I ended up getting work through NATO and the UN and other international military organizations that I never really imagined that would be interested in this issue set. But as I said before, in the beginning, I was very interested in women. How do women solve problems? I was interested in feminism and peace. And there wasn't any job to work on that. But I just kind of followed the breadcrumbs and I followed my interest in what I was really passionate about. And women, peace, and security as a field started developing as in parallel to my career path. And so I would say to people, you know, there was no such job as a director of Women, Peace and Security program when I was in grad school, or even, you know, 5 years ago. So I would say this field is a very dynamic field. I mean, just in general, foreign policymaking is a very dynamic field. It can be a very creative field. And so it's very important to follow what is truly important to you, because that will lead you more than the title or, you know, the particular issue set. It's really finding your passion and keeping the conviction about making a contribution really to the world. That's the way I see foreign policy. So I'll stop there, because there's so many other stories we could tell, but I'm sure we'll share later.
Great. Thank you so much, Sahana. What an interesting way to navigate, right? I love that you have the guidepost, which was your gut, right? Just keep following your gut and what your passion is. And you brought that to light. And I think, you know, I'm looking forward to us discussing that and exploring that topic more. So we're going to move on to our next panelist. And our next panelist comes to us as a Truman Fellow, and that is Alison Garfield. So Alison, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be among these great women here. I actually went into graduate school almost 20 years ago, and initially thought that I was going to go in for international development. But then my first year there was 9/11, and I think that changed a lot of people's decisions about what they were going to pursue in their career path. And a lot of folks like me decided to pursue national security. And of course, there was a big hiring spree by the US government afterwards. And like Jaysha, I was a presidential management fellow. I was assigned to the Department of Defense, and I thought for sure that I would only stay for a few years, but ended up staying for 10. It flew by. I was given a ton of really great opportunities. I spent a year working for the Senate Appropriations Committee. DOD sent me there. I worked for the DOD Comptroller. I was the North Korea country director. I worked on WMD, military and financial sanctions. And then in my final 3 years, again, like Jaysha, I was sent to London and worked as an exchange officer for the UK Ministry of Defence, which was a fantastic experience. So after 10 years, I decided to see what else was out there. And so I left government service and went to the private sector. And I jumped to financial services, largely because there was a really good link with what I had done on the sanctions piece. And so I went into financial crimes compliance, and I've since worked at 3 financial institutions, which has been fantastic. But I think something that we haven't touched on is, again, I was able to continue the national security aspect, sort of, with the financial crimes compliance and trying to, you know, catch money launderers and whatnot. So I've always been into like catching the bad guy. But I was mid-career and starting in a new field. And so I left government service as a GS-15 and started in financial services a bit down the chain from there. So it's been a challenge. I've worked my way back up, but I think something that we can probably touch on is you know, if you are done with your government service and have moved on from that and you want to try a new career field, trying to leverage your government experience into that. So that took me about a year to find a new job. So it wasn't easy, but I'm super happy in financial services compliance. And the way that I'm able to stay connected to the national security field is through an organization, a national organization called Truman National Security Project. And I belong to the Colorado chapter. I live in Denver. And it's a national organization focused on progressive national security policies. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Allison. And thank you for bringing up that point. I think there's a lot of us that have taken a sidestep in our career, whether it's to follow our individual pursuits and passions or raise a family or, travel. There's a lot of things to be learned about really following your thread and even sometimes taking a step back. So I know for myself, when I went into entrepreneurship and owned a food truck, and then I came back into aerospace, I jumped 3 pegs down from where I was, and it took me a couple of years to work back up. But I think, that's useful for people to hear. So thank you for sharing that. And we'll move on to our last panelist. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Samantha Edgington. And she is with the Geostationary Lightning Mapper program at Lockheed Martin.
Hi, thank you. I'm excited to be here and learn from all of these great women on this panel. So I kind of came to the intelligence community, I don't know, through the back door, totally sideways. I went to undergrad and graduate school in physics. I was studying astrophysics and building instruments to measure the cosmic microwave background. So that's not super related to intelligence, but I realized after 6 years of graduate school that academia wasn't for me. And I had thought I was going to be in academia since I was about 9 years old, and realized that a career as a ballerina was not going to happen. So but I was convinced that, the second choice was, physics, and that was going to be great. And I was going to be a professor. And then after 6 years of graduate school, realized that that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to actually be able to build instruments and do the science, as opposed to, academia is the job. Even 20 years ago, when I was in graduate school, the job prospects were not great, and now they're even worse. So if I want to actually build the instruments, where do I go? And it turns out that defense contractors build a lot of the instruments that go into space. A lot of the things that NASA puts in space are built by places like Lockheed Martin. So I ended up working at Lockheed Martin and got onto the GLM, the Geostationary Lightning Mapper program, right at the beginning, when it was a PowerPoint presentation and some crossed fingers. And but we won the program, and I spent 12 years building the instrument and getting it on the telescope, getting the instrument onto the spacecraft, and getting there's 2 launched now. We just delivered the last one. There was 4 in total, and at first I thought, this is all science. Like this is all just engineering and science. I'm doing the same thing I was doing in graduate school. But I had a really interesting conversation with one of the fellows at Lockheed Martin. So he had been around for possibly forever, and had seen all kinds of programs, and we were having trouble with the instrument, and he came to help us. And he was talking about how he thinks of a lot of the things that Lockheed Martin does, obviously, or defense contracts, are very related to the intelligence community, but national security isn't just protecting us from, the bad guys or the people in other countries. It's protecting us from anything, and protecting us from that storm that's coming that can spawn tornadoes is also kind of part of national security. And being able to predict hurricanes, and be able to predict climate change, and being able to help with flooding and sea level rise, and all of that stuff comes into national security. And they're all together and that you can work with all the people in the intelligence community that that are worried about slightly different things, but some of those things they're also worried about, and kind of all work together to kind of expand so he really helped me expand my idea of what national security was, and so that I can so I've been working in weather and remote sensing, and so then you can also apply a lot of that work to also work. Not only can you apply the technology, but you can apply you know, the ideas of what you're trying to do to the whole national security kind of community, both within Lockheed and also within the government. So.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Samantha. That's really interesting. I share a similar story. I did not get into aerospace thinking I was going to work in national security, and have experienced a wonderful career in national security as well. So, you know, sometimes following your passion really leads you to the fields that you end up in as well. And, you know, it's been a fun ride. And I want to take a moment to really recognize that each one of you is a trailblazer in your field. Right? So it's advanced technologies, it's policy, it's humanitarian aid, it is understanding how women affect peace and security. And I want to just applaud all of you for that. And touching on that, let's talk a little bit about what it's like to be a trailblazer. And sometimes you don't necessarily look like everybody else in the room, right? And so typically entering a field of national security is still predominantly dominated by men. And so typically it's about anywhere from 60 to 70% male. It's starting to grow, but it's about 30 to 40% female. So I'd love to hear your experiences around what it was like and how you really stepped into your confidence, knowing that maybe you were the only one. Sometimes in your classes, sometimes in a boardroom or a meeting room or an international meeting, and really how you kind of overcame any of those initial fears or doubts you may have had. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to actually start with Sahana. Could you share some of your experiences around that?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question, because working on women, peace, and security, you know, you are bringing a different lens to national security, to problem solving, to the way people traditionally think about foreign policy. And you're bringing a feminist lens, and you are really advocating for equality in the decision-making process and in the whatever the program, the policy, the legislation, whatever it is that people are working on. You're really advocating for those things, and I will guarantee you, even today, you will be probably the only person in the room really advocating strongly. But I think the difference today is you'll have many more people that are open to this idea and who want to know how to do it. Whereas I think when I was beginning, as I said, you know, traditional realist conversations. So yeah, being the only one in the room, and as a woman, I think people don't like to identify as I'm a woman, so my perspective is different. We want to be recognized as professionals in our field and competent in the things that we were trained in. And I think that that's true. And I also think that when women do feel comfortable and confident in applying their personal lens and their experience to what they're working on, you do get a very different perspective. You do get a very different set of solutions to consider when you're doing problem solving. So I don't know if that actually answers your question, but I feel like that's some of the experiences, yeah, that I've had. And I would just say, just be prepared for the pushback. Be prepared for it, and don't take it personally, because it's going to happen a lot. It can happen a lot. And there's no reason for you to put your energies in getting too sucked into that discouragement. It always motivated me to figure out how to be more just more creative in my persuasiveness. Like how many other ways can I say this? How many other research projects can I come up with to show you the data on this? And because I'm convinced that it's true, that I'm right in my position. So yeah, so I think that's some of my experience.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. I mean, the research actually shows that when women create teams, when they lead teams, they create more gender diverse and more perception diverse teams. And because of that, they actually are quicker to make decisions. And they tend to create an inclusive environment where those decisions can be made with a mind that is to the logic and to the outcome. So that's a great point. Would anybody else like to jump in and share what some of their experiences are like? So I think Jaisha is raising her hand, waving at me. So Jaisha, please join the conversation.
Great, thanks. No, I just have one story. When I was working at the National Reconnaissance Office, I found myself the only woman at the table, but it was a table full of generals and other senior government officials. So not only was I the only woman, but I was also in my mid-20s at the time. And so it was a bit of an intimidating situation, to say the least. And it was very high pressure. We were deciding how to shoot down a satellite, right? So the stakes are high. I was afraid to raise my voice initially, but the thing that got me through it was knowing that I was representing the State Department at that table. And so that additional pressure, that there was so much on my shoulders, gave me the courage to really raise my voice. And it was a great opportunity to really practice raising my voice in those types of situations. And it trained me for the rest of my career, where even today, I'm often the only woman at the table.
Well, having been on the other side of that analysis, Jaisha, I'm so glad you raised your voice. So Jaisha and I have actually known each other for quite some time, because I worked all of those events she's talking about, but on the NASIC side. So identifying the threat and analyzing it. So I'm so glad you were able to do that. I think Alison wants to chime in here next.
Yeah, I mean, I with 10 years at the Defense Department, I was maybe one of two women, frequently the only woman in a room. And I was also in a position where I was frequently the only civilian. And as we all know, the military is civilian led. And I was from the part of DOD that basically creates the policies that then the military has to implement. So I was the one coming in there telling them how we were going to respond to a North Korean nuke test and the range of options that we were going to discuss, and got a lot of pushback. People would not respond to me and instead would go straight to my boss. People would interrupt me, and I think it was almost helpful being young and a little bit naive, because I didn't necessarily wasn't aware just how sexist it was. I think now I would have a lot less patience for it, but it's great practice for the real world. And since leaving the Defense Department, I have found the rooms that I've been in to be much more equitable in terms of gender. So it was great practice at a very young age.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. Samantha, would you like to chime in on some of your experiences?
Sure. So, graduate school in physics was not very gender diverse. Hopefully it's better now. I was the only woman in my entire year of 25 graduate students. So it sucks. I could never skip class. They would always be able to tell if I wasn't there. But and it was like some of this, I was young, just out of undergraduate. I was, 18. I had no idea I was like 20 something. And I didn't know as aware of some of the stuff that was going on. So when my advisor said things like, well, you're going to have to change the way you talk because no one's going to take you seriously at conferences, I was like, oh, okay, I should do that. And then like 10 years later, I'm like, wait, hold on, that was terrible. Like, why would you say that? And as part of the reason I left academia was because it's just so terrible for women in so many ways. And I felt kind of guilty for leaving because I'm like, well, I could, soldier on and make this work and, be one of those people that shows everyone that it can be done and brings younger women along with her. And I'm like, I'm tired. I can't do this. And, so I went to aerospace, and I know a lot of people come into aerospace thinking, wow, there's like hardly any women here. There's a lot of sexist men in charge. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. Everyone is nice. And like the men aren't horrifying. And it's like, it was great. And so it's been really nice to be able to find the people that I worked with that you could open up about some of the stuff that happens in meetings that men don't have to think about. Like the person I share an office with was looking at over my shoulder. I was like, why are you typing so much on that email? Just send it. I'm like, no, I've got to make sure that I don't say I think, or maybe you can, and I've got to take out all the exclamation points. And he's like, what? So I'm like, okay, let's have a little like writing emails 101. This is what women do when they write emails. And he's all like, wow, I never thought of that. And then I'm like, oh yeah. And then in meetings, when men interrupt you all the time, or they'll say the same thing you did without crediting what you said, or will disagree with you in some like unpleasant way that they would never like speak to a man like, and he started seeing it happening and he would totally call it out. And I'm like, wait, I could call it out too. And so it's been, obviously it's easier for him to call it out because of course, but it has really been, I think, at least through my career, getting so much better. And I'm so glad that going a bit faster. And it's been really important to me to bring other women and other minorities into the programs that I'm working on. And as it's kind of weird to think of myself as someone who can like help make decisions about who works on things. Like, wait, aren't I still at the beginning of my career? But no. And so it's been really important to bring, new engineers on and make sure that people have opportunities that make teams that are, as Jamie was saying, like you have a team of different people and it makes the team stronger in the end. You want to build the best instrument, you got to find the diverse team to build it, and it makes it better. So
thanks so much for sharing that. Being someone who came up in aerospace, there weren't a lot of women, but I imagine there were more than physics. So I definitely can appreciate that. A lot of us have talked about that intersectionality. And when we did a word cloud for International Women's Day, that was one of the big words that came up and was repeated. And that can mean a lot of different things. For me, intersectionality means I am an aerospace engineer, I am an entrepreneur, and I am a woman. Right? Those are sort of the things I identify with. So I'd love to hear what intersectionality means to you and how you bring the strengths from all those different experiences to the table. So if you wouldn't mind, let's start with Jaysha.
Yeah, for me, I think it's been kind of melding together all the various issues I've covered throughout my career and trying to find ways to work them in together. So for example, when I was at the National Security Council, the director for cyber policy. But as I mentioned earlier, my passion was really space. And so I was always brainstorming, how can I bring space into this conversation? So I was able to convince my boss to let me form a working group on space cybersecurity in my free time, which was like after 7 p.m. and on the weekends. But very pleased to note that the group was successfully formed and we issued a space policy directive last year. And so I think for me, the intersectionality is not just working on one issue, but trying to see where they intersect throughout my career, which will make me more versatile down the road if I ever did want to go back to a space job in the future.
Great, thanks. Sahana, would you like to share some of your experiences?
Oh yeah, intersectionality. I mean, you're speaking my language there, because doing gender analysis and using a gender perspective is exactly that. And what I find really fascinating is, because I do work with a lot of men in the security sector, it is that word is being used a lot now, and within the last couple of years. And before that, if people wouldn't even know what you were talking about. I mean, that's like deep, like, you know, deconstruction, Derrida, Foucault, you got to wear a black turtleneck to read the, you know, deep philosophy and theory about deconstructionism. So I think it's fascinating. And one story I have is actually a couple, pretty recent, maybe before, it was right before the pandemic. There was a military conference in, I think it was, I don't know, somewhere on the East Coast, near DC, and a lot of different panels from the different military university institutions. And I happened to be on one with a gentleman from the Naval War College who was a sociologist, but he's ex-Marine, you know, professor at the Naval War College. And he was going to talk about, you know, gender in the workforce, in the military. And I was on the panel with him, and I was going to share some work on women's participation in the security sector. And it was really fascinating to me, because I went first and I said, well, you know, when we include its gender perspective, it leads to increased operational effectiveness. And so, you know, we try to use the language that they're using to communicate better with them. But when he started talking, he said, yeah, well, we did this, we took an intersectional approach to look at the different identities of women, and you know, this is not and men, and this is not binary. I was like, oh my God, like I'm here talking about operational effectiveness and he's using the word intersectionality. Like what just happened? So I think that it's fascinating that the word is entering into our vocabulary, especially in the foreign policy realm. I do think that there is a bit of confusion about what these terms mean, like equality and equity and fairness, sameness, empowerment. And I think that we have to do a better job of being really clear that equality is the ultimate goal for people to benefit and participate fully in society. And then equity is about fair process, because I think if we don't get that, the words right, whatever conversation we have about intersectionality will quickly go into identity politics, and we'll get really quickly off topic in terms of the things that we are trying to solve.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Sahana. You know, for me, I talk a lot about parity, right? So having not only the opportunity, but the sense of belonging, right? So just getting a seat at the table doesn't mean that we're being heard necessarily. So creating that sense of belonging where we can be heard, we can support each other, no matter of gender identification or intersectionality of your background, your culture, what organization you're coming from. So those of us who've worked in the DoD or the international communities, as well as the intelligence communities, know that the NRO doesn't like to talk to the CIA, doesn't like to necessarily talk to the NGA. and all that. So that even becomes part of the conversation as well. But, I thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. We're going to take a little bit of a shift, and we're going to take an audience question right now. We have a great audience question. It comes from Shay. She is graduating tomorrow, right? So she wants to know, since she is graduating undergrad tomorrow, she's still trying to find her passion, right? So look at, she's on video and waving. Perfect. So she's still trying to find her passion. And here are 4 incredible women who are able to follow that guidepost of their passion inside of them. So if you could share a tip or a trick on how you really find those passions, some strategies, maybe mentorship or brainstorming, we'd love to hear that. So Alison, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. It's a great question. And I asked myself that very same question my spring of my senior year of college. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I think a lot of folks sort of just assume like you choose this job in this field and then you stay there for life. But that sounded horrible to me. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm still not quite sure what I want to do with my life. And I graduated 25 years ago. So I think my advice to someone who's coming out of undergrad right now is just take any job that you think sounds vaguely interesting, try it out. If it's horrible after 6 months, find something else. Because your 20s and even your 30s are the time to jump around and figure out what your passion is. And I think the only way that you can do it is by actually trying it out. So don't feel like you have to have it all nailed down and locked away and know what you want to do with your life, because trust me, whatever you decide now is going to change in 10 years, and then again 5 years later, and then again 10 years later. So
great. How about Samantha? You have any tips you could share with Shay?
I think that for me, I really thought I knew what I wanted to do. I didn't end up doing that, but I had a plan, and but life kind of throws stuff at you that you weren't expecting, and you change your mind about what you want. And so being able to take advantage of opportunities as they come up is important, because mine, and I think a lot of people's career path is full of, oh, and then I kind of got this job by accident, or I met this person and at some random conference, and then I started this new project. And it's not really that you just kind of fell into your job, and it sounds like that but what really happened was an opportunity came by and you were prepared enough to take advantage of it. And if it sounded like something that was interesting, you could go and take advantage of it. And I think in your question, you said like brainstorming and talking with mentors. And I think that those are all great things to do. And what the thing that has never guided me wrong, this is kind of a silly thing, but this is how I decided where to go to college. This is how I decided where to go to grad school. I had a few options, and I literally flipped a coin. I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna flip a coin. And so I'm flipping a coin about where I'm gonna go to college. And my parents were like, I swear, going to melt into the ground in stress because I was doing this. I'm like, and as soon as the coin landed, I'm like, oh no. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, now I know that I don't want to do that. I want to do the other one. So sometimes you've got to find a way to let your subconscious tell you what you wanted to do all along. Sometimes it knows before you do. And that's what helps me. Flip a coin, and then if you look at the answer and go, ugh, then you know. Or if you look at the answer and go, oh, yes, thank you, and you know that that's the right thing.
That's fantastic. Actually, that's how I do takeout. So I'm like, do I want Thai food?
It works with everything.
How about Jaysha? You have any tips you could share with Shay?
Absolutely. I love that you brought up the mentorship. And I think that that is so important. But some people might not know how to go about finding mentors. And I have an interesting story. So one day I got a random LinkedIn request from a woman that I didn't know, asking if we could grab coffee to talk about space. And I was like, sure. This was pre-COVID. And we met up and I asked her, well, who else have you met with from the space community? And she listed 10 different names of some of my closest space friends in the community. And so this woman was so brave to just cold call people and ask them. And more often than not, women are looking to mentor others because we were mentored by so many women along the way. And so the hardest thing is just making that ask, but don't be afraid to do it. And once you do make that ask, don't be afraid, please follow up so that they remember you. And so, for example, another woman that I met, very bright, looking for career advice. And then my office had a job opening. And I thought of her immediately because she seemed like such a great person, great, enthusiastic, very talented. And so there could be job opportunities that come down the road out of it as well.
That's great advice as well. And I will add to that is that the community of women in national security is small. So even though this panel was put together, I knew most of the women on the panel already, whether I had heard about them or we had worked together previously. So use your network and create it. And don't be afraid to ask for mentorship either. And Sahana, do you have any additional tips you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to think about what you like to do. Like, what do you enjoy spending time doing? Do you like writing? Do you like reading? Do you like talking about how to solve problems with your friends? I think that it's really important to look at yourself that way so that you can kind of see, oh, there's a little seed there that needs to be cultivated, right? And you can cultivate a lot of that through whatever job you get in your first initial, career steps out in the world. I think it's also really important to think about, how can I create value, whatever it is I'm doing. There were so many jobs I had along the way that that were part-time jobs, that were jobs that really didn't suit me or didn't pay a lot of money, but there were my driving determination really was, how do I create value in this place and what can I learn? And I think the point about mentors is a really good one, to reach out to other people and cold call. I mean, that is what we all had to do, and ask for informational interviews and ask for help. But I also think in my career, I've also had a lot of help from my peers all along the way. And it's been great to be, I think, as Jamie said, it's a small community of women, and it's really nice to be able to know I can talk to my colleagues who have been walking along the same, or not the same path, but in the same circle and going through very similar things, and check in with them from time to time and ask for their advice. Or sometimes I see things that they're doing that I didn't think of, and oh, that's a pretty good idea. I should check that out too. So I think, yeah, like, don't be too hard on yourself when you're trying to figure out, gee, what's my passion? You probably have things that you're here tonight, right? So you're obviously interested in this subject. And I think it's just following that thread and letting yourself explore,
That's great advice. I'm also going to share something a little embarrassing. So this is a picture of me at about 9 years old. It sits on my desk every day so I can see it, because I want to be this girl forever, right? This girl believes in the good in the world. This girl loves to make friends. She goes out and she explores, and she loves cats and dogs and, probably Lisa Frank, maybe a little too much, but she loves to be creative, right? And that is when I stepped back into engineering, I had to find a job that allowed me to tap into that entrepreneurial and that creative mindset, because that's who I am at my core. So I try to tell people I mentor that who you are at 9, you probably are that same person still right? So if you love to ride horses at 9 years old, maybe volunteer with horses, and that leads you to the next thing that you're going to do, is just an example. We're running out of time, but we did have a lot of great audience questions. I will stay on and answer them in the chat. We're going to take one and kind of put a little bit of a twist on it about women supporting women in national security. You know, so the question is, sometimes women aren't as supportive as men. What I'd love to hear from you is, who are the women that championed you in your career path? And how did you kind of navigate times when you weren't feel like you were being championed? So if you don't mind, Samantha, we'll start with you.
Sure. So at the very beginning of my career path, it was hard to find women, unfortunately, but there were a few fellow grad students, not in my department or my year, unfortunately, but you know, they existed in the university, and we tried to champion each other, which is sometimes more challenging because, you know, you don't have someone in that's kind of at the table yet. And so they were wonderful. We helped each other through the craziness that is grad school. And the people that, you know, they were talking about how sometimes men are more supportive than women. And I've certainly, I always called them, I don't know whether they were the women who don't support younger women. I always called them ladder pullers. Like, you got up to the top of the ladder and then you pulled it up after yourself. Like, that's, and kind of had the idea that, well, I had to suffer through it, and so it somehow made me a better person, and so you should suffer too. And I always thought that was silly because, you know, why would you want someone to suffer through something needlessly just because you did? Like, got to make the world better in the future, not worse. And so it's important to kind of identify people who are like that quickly and not get too discouraged by it, because I was disappointed several times by that kind of dynamic, and it kind of made it so that it's harder to reach out to mentors and people to ask for help if you have had that happen and get your hand slapped back a couple times. So but now there's some amazing women that I'm working with, and by some amazing miracle, my manager, because I don't know whether this happens at lots of companies or not, but Lockheed Martin kind of shuffles you around between managers every like 3 or 4 years. They decide they have a different plan for who's getting managed by who, and I finally got my manager is now someone who I really respect. She's amazing, and I'm really excited to be working for her and with her, and so hopefully I can head off any more changes. The next change is due in like another couple years, so I've got some time to like stop them from moving me. Like, no, I found the person. You're not allowed to change. So so it's been really good that I've been able to find the people who really will champion your, and I don't know, like this past year has been really hard for everyone, and it has been my experience that a lot of the people that I've managed to surround myself with have been extremely supportive, not only of me, but everyone. Like, when I walked into my boss's office a couple weeks ago, so March like 10th or 11th last year, I'm like, they're gonna close the schools. I can't go to school. I can't come to work anymore. And she's like, you think they're gonna close the schools? I'm like, they're gonna close the schools. And she's like, oh, well, we'll figure it out. And, you know, 2 days later, they closed all the schools, and and she really went to bat to make sure that all the people that worked for her were able to do what they needed to do to handle, you know, having to be at home or being able to come into, or not being able to come to work. And then, you know, however people needed to be supported with whatever their situation was. And so once you find people like that, it's important to hang on to them with both hands.
I love that advice.
Yeah.
All right, Alison, would you like to share with us some of the women that have championed you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I will say this, and I don't know if others have had the same experience. So when I first started at DoD as a PMF, there were a couple of younger women, more than a couple, like a handful of young women who were around my age and same, point in their careers. And it almost felt a little bit like there could only be, like, the ability for multiple women to do well was really limited at DoD. Like, they would only be okay with like one or two superstars, but more than that was not okay. And I think it like created almost a very uncomfortable vibe among the women. Almost a competitive atmosphere when there just didn't need to be. But as I've gotten older and more advanced in my career, I feel like that's totally changed, and feel like we've all sort of been through the trenches, recognize that, we weren't the ones pitting ourselves against each other. It was, the outside pressures. And now those of us at the same, point in our career people I've kept in touch with over the past 15, 20 years, we're all really supportive of each other. So I think that's just one thing that I wanted to point out. I don't know if that's still the case at places like DoD. That was my personal experience. So yeah, I saw a couple of head nods, so maybe other people experienced it too.
How about you, Jaysha?
Yeah, so I'll just start out by noting that I have had the ultimate role model as a child. My grandmother was a service pilot in World War II. So talk about a rock star role model to have in your life growing up. So that taught me from a young age that really anything was possible. But unfortunately, most of my bosses throughout my career have been men. But that said, I have had strong female mentors throughout. And I find that when it comes time for me to consider changing jobs, I like to go to my female mentors who I think may have more of the compassionate side and understanding about some of the considerations and how scary that might be. And one of them in particular always tells me that if you are completely comfortable in your job, it's time to go, time to move on to the next opportunity. And so I've really valued that mentorship.
Excellent. Sahana, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I've had both really, really great men and women as mentors. And I think because of the work that I do with women in peace building, those communities of women peace builders, it's kind of almost like family. So you have all the good and all the bad, all the complications of relationships are in that. But there is something really nice to be with the old school feminists now who, before you start a meeting, they bring out all the snacks and they ask you, they want to celebrate the person's birthdays first, and they want to, it's very different than the way we do feminism and the way younger women get together and do their work. But I think it's a really sweet and important aspect of this sort of intergenerational work of women in the workplace. And one thing I wanted to mention, I don't have children, but I'm guessing that others on the panel have children or families or whatever. And I think that one thing that I think I would have benefited from early in my career is not, whenever we talk about having a career path, in general, the story is, it makes it sound like, oh, there's a career path that you'll be doing your profession, whether it's in one organization or another, but it'll be a consistent, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year shot, right? And you might take a break to have kids, or you might take a break to do this or that. But I would say, really, women have to think about their careers in a very different way, because we will have to leave the workforce for children, for an elderly parent, if you have an illness, if you become a trailing spouse. I mean, there are so many things that happen in women's lives that, and I think the expectation is for women to be much more flexible with their partner about personal decisions like that, that I think that it would be really important to tell that to younger people when they're making decisions about not just what do they want to do, but also financially, right? How are you going to continue your career and your interests and supporting yourself, even when you might have a family and you might have a spouse, or you might feel in a comfortable position. But those things are really, I think, really critical, and we don't really talk about them enough. And there's, as I work with my team who are just out of grad school, I know I kind of harass them a little bit about, did you sign up for the 401k? Are you saving your money? Because I say to them, I want you to have the economic wherewithal to continue to work on peace if that's what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And that is not something that I was even considering, because, working in an NGO, you were hardly making any money at all. Nobody talked about those things, right? But I think that is a missing piece of the conversation for young women in whatever career they're going in, but especially in careers that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I really wish we had more time, because I would love to dive into that subject. I know, when I mentor women, I tell them to set their boundaries, right? And your boundaries can change, just like a road has guardrails, at different points. But for me personally, my boundaries were, I wanted to own a business at some point. So that meant I was going to step out of national security to go own a business, right? So that was my child. That's the way I saw it. I took my own maternity leave of 4 years to go start and raise a business. I wanted to be financially independent, no matter what happens, spouse, no spouse, partner, no partner. So those are the things that, as I was a young woman, I was setting up those boundaries, not knowing that they were going to guide me along this career path or career journey along the way. So that's great advice for anybody at any age. So thanks so much for bringing that up. I know we have a bunch of questions in the chat. Like I said, I'll stay on and answer a couple of questions, but our panelists are on different time zones as well, and we appreciate all of their time. We applaud all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today, for continuing the conversation about emerging paths and national security for International Women's Day. We're actually going to hand it over now to John Krieger. He's going to say a couple words, but a virtual round of applause for everybody. Thank you for joining us in the conversation.
Well, thank you, Jamie. And I want to thank our audience here on Zoom and those joining us on Facebook Live. I'm in such complete awe of the women that the leaders we've been able to feature this evening, and also last Monday at our International Women's Day celebration event. We want to thank all the panelists for the insights they shared tonight, as well as their continued leadership in the advancement of women in peace, security, and technology. And thank you again, of course, to Jamie Landers, our International Women's Day event co-chair and moderator for this evening, and Lockheed Martin, whose support and thought leadership makes these conversations and collaborations possible. I just want to give one last reminder that you can watch the full recording of the International Women's Day celebration now at worlddenver.org. And I invite everyone to join us on March 30th, as Tiffany mentioned at the beginning, for a networking happy hour for young professionals from more than a half dozen globally minded Denver-based nonprofit organizations. You can register for that event now at worlddenver.org. Finally, membership is the driver for all the work that we do to continue to connect Denver to the world. So right now we have a special International Women's Day membership discount, including an annual young professional membership that's just $45. And that gives you access to our network, to our events, and makes you a part of this community of globally focused professionals here in Denver. We want to keep this conversation going. We're so thankful to everyone who's participated this evening. We will see you again very soon. Thanks again, everyone.